בוקר טוב, אני טל רביב ממכון שלמה שמלצר לתחבורה חכמה באוניברסיטת תל אביב. ועדת הכנס מורכבת גם מפרופסור יצחק בננסון, ראש המעבדה לגיאוסימולציה וניתוח מרחבי באוניברסיטה, פרופסור מיכל צור, ראש המחלקה להנדסת תעשייה, ודוקטור אילית אופנהיים, מנהלת המכון שעשתה כאן את רוב העבודה. תודה גם לעמית צורף שעוזרת לנו כאן היום. אנחנו שמחים לארח אתכם היום פיזית בקמפוס. ליתר ביטחון ארגנו את הכנס בצורה היברידית, אתם תראו את ההשלכות של זה בהמשך, ויש קהל וגם דוברים שמגיעים, נמצאים בכל העולם. יש לנו חלק מההרצאות גם בגלל זה יינתנו באנגלית וחלקן לא. יש לנו תוכנית עמוסה ומרתקת ואנחנו מקווים שתענו. אני מתכבד להזמין את פרופסור יורם שיפטן, ראש מרכז המחקר הישראלי לתחבורה חכמה, לברך.
תודה טל, בוקר טוב, and welcome Kai, good morning, I see you there, but I'll bless in Hebrew. אני שמח לפתוח את הכנס הראשון של המרכז הישראלי למחקר בתחבורה חכמה. האמת שאוניברסיטת תל אביב לקחה על עצמה לארח את הכנס, הייתי קצת סקפטי שנוכל להיות פה פיזית, אז אני שמח מאוד שאנחנו פה, גם שפיזית ונפגשים פנים אל פנים. אני מתנצל מראש מסיבות אישיות בלתי צפויות, אני לא אוכל להישאר היום, אבל אני שמח שהגענו לכאן. המרכז פועל כבר קצת יותר משנה וחצי, אחרי שנה וחצי עמוסה ומאתגרת עם הקורונה, אבל זה הכנס הראשון, אבל זה לא הפעילות הראשונה. היה לנו את האירוע הפתיחה שהטכניון ארגן במרץ כבר, שהיה לנו כנס סטודנטים שבר אילן ארגנו, והכנס היום אוניברסיטת תל אביב מארגנת. אנחנו בהחלט מרכז לאומי, והכוונה שהפעילויות הם התפזרו בכל הארץ על ידי כל המוסדות. כנס הסטודנטים הבא, האוניברסיטה העברית לקחה על עצמה לארגן, אני שמח לעדכן, וגברת חי אלון, מנהלת המרכז בצהריים, תעדכן אתכם עוד קצת בפעילויות שבאות הלאה. היו לנו גם הרבה וובינרים שאנחנו עושים, הכל נמצא באתר דרך אגב, אני אקצר בדבריי שנגיע להרצאה ישירות. האתר שלנו כולל את כל האינפורמציה, כל האירועים שהיו ויהיו, והיו שני קולות קוראים למחקרים, כבר יש המחקרים של הקורונה שמתקדמים, היה קול קורא נוסף שהתחיל לתעדכן אתכם מה קורה איתו בצהריים, והיו קולות קוראים לסטודנטים, קיבלו מלגות לפרסים, מצטיינים. אנחנו בהחלט פעילים ואני חושב שאנחנו יכולים להיות גאים בפעילות שכבר קיימת, וכאמור הכל במרכז. כאמור, אני לא רוצה להאריך בדברים, רק להודות לצוות של אוניברסיטת תל אביב, טל ציין את כל השמות, אני לא אחזור עליהם, אז תודה רבה לצוות, שיהיה יום פורה ומענה, וניגש ישר לעניינים. אז תודה.
אז אנחנו מתחילים עבודת הכנס. בדרך לכאן, אני הבנתי שהכנס הזה מסמן סוף הניסוי הענק שהתרחש בלי שאנחנו הכרנו אותו, זה שנת הקורונה. ובמשך שנת הקורונה אנחנו למדנו איך לא להגיע לעבודה, ויחד עם זה להפעיל את כל הפעילויות שאנחנו מפעילים כל יום. אחרי שהניסוי הסתיים אנחנו חזרנו, והתברר שהדבר שהכי אהוב עלינו זה לעמוד בפקקים ולשמוע מוזיקה ברדיו. אפילו היה לנו כזה ניסיון נוסף בסוף, שהייתה איזו הפסקה למלחמה קצרה, שוב פעם הכל היה פנוי ושוב פעם חזרנו. אז כנראה אנחנו עכשיו הבנו שהאדפטציה אישית עובדת מצוין, אבל האדפטציה המערכתית איכשהו לא עובדת, אנחנו חוזרים כל הזמן למצב יציב שהוא כנראה רובסטי בצורה יוצאת מן הכלל, והרובסטיות הזאת חייבת להשתנות. אז יכול להיות שמה שעכשיו אנחנו נשמע בקינוט זאת הדרך איכשהו להגיע למצב חדש של מערכת התחבורה, ואני עובר לאנגלית. So I'm happy to present the keynote speaker of this session, of this conference. It's the first conference in presence after a long period of corona work from home. I'm happy to present Professor Kai Nagel. He is full professor for transport system planning and transport telematics at the Berlin Institute of Technology. Kai was trained in physics and climate research, and his PhD is in informatics from the University of Köln, Germany. He worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory between 1995-99, and then at ETH Zurich until 2004. And from 2004, he's at his current position at Technical University of Berlin. Kai's research interests include large-scale transportation simulations, modeling and simulation of socioeconomic systems, and large-scale computing. He has more than 100 publications and is an editor of the journal Networks and Spatial Economics. Not less important is that Kai is the leader of the famous SmartSim software. This is the major open source environment for large-scale multi-agent transportation simulations that is used in numerous academic and applied research teams over the globe. We also use it and present the paper on this system here later at the session. So Kai, the virtual floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. This is interesting. In some sense, I think this is the future, or is at least part of the future. I would be extremely happy to come to Tel Aviv, but I have to admit right now it's in the middle of the teaching, and so it actually might not have worked. And so maybe this is a decent compromise, and I think the technology is working better and better for this. So thank you very much for this invitation. Itzhak has said a little bit about what we work on. Actually, we have been busy doing COVID simulations for the last year, because it's pretty clear if you have a traffic model, you can attach virus and virus dynamics, and then you can try to predict. And it actually always, this activity participation level was an important part of what was going on, but we decided to talk about something different today. And what we want to talk about is smart mobility. So, and this is now always the problem, the camera is there, but you are there. So the confusion that I think everybody knows by now. My collaborators on this here is Ihab Kadura, Gregor Leichtelmann, Schlenter, and some others. And I mean, as usual, they have been doing the work, and I'm trying to present it in some kind of a bit coherent picture. The starting point is something like this, that you can have Uber-like services in cities and rural areas. I guess this is known to pretty much everybody, at least in this community. So in Germany, we have vehicles like this and this. This is running in Berlin, and it still has a human driver, and it's doing ride pooling. This is running experimentally. It doesn't have a human driver. This is by EasyMile, a company that you probably have heard of, which is kind of trying to do these things in a driverless way. This is a user interface that you can have where you essentially, you say, I want to go to this place. It knows where you are because it has a GPS, and then it will make suggestions, and it will say, okay, you can pick something in 4 minutes or in 14 minutes, and it will attach a price, how much this is, and then you can book it, and then you have to walk over there and stuff like that. So I think this is pretty clear in this community now. This presentation is about a German perspective to this, and I mean, I have discussed with Itzhak, at least very shortly, that might not be the same you have, but I think it's still interesting, maybe gives you one or the other idea. And the question that we have is, how can we integrate that into the existing public transport system, where we essentially say in inner cities, we already have sufficient public transport. So PT in this presentation is public transport, but we actually don't have enough road space for other stuff. So if we have, on top of everything that's already running around, if we start having these vehicles driving around in large numbers, they will just not fit there. And I will actually come back to this at the end, because right now the regulatory framework is, as long as they don't need subsidies, they can actually do whatever they want. So they can actually clog up the road space for everybody, including themselves, and there's nothing we can do. And so that needs to be addressed. In rural areas, it's actually totally different. We have totally insufficient public transport. We usually try to run it anyways, but it's this thing that the bus that comes every 2 hours. But then on the other hand, if you start running this as a private company, you have a human driver, it's actually financially not so viable. And we had a project which was called AFEF, which is, if you translate this, automated and network public transport. It's kind of a pretty nice acronym because ÖV in German is just public transport. So it's automated and networked public transport. And that was funded for 3 years. And most of the results here are from that project. So what I'm trying to do, I will try to explain a little bit how we simulate ride sharing. And actually it's kind of ride sharing, or DRT, which is demand responsive transit, or robotaxi, or sometimes taxi, or autonomous vehicle. I usually mean the same thing. So autonomous vehicle doesn't mean that it's privately owned, which is evidently an option, but it means it's owned by some kind of fleet operator who's using it. I will very shortly say something about a case study that we use for calibration. Unfortunately, there, the real world data is not open, so there's really not a lot you can learn except that we try to calibrate it. Then I will generalize to other areas, and one of them is very rural, and one of them is the Berlin city, and we will actually see that the results start to differentiate quite a lot. And then I will say a little bit about economic viability in different regulated regimes. So that's the plan. And this is MATSIM, that also was mentioned by Itzhak, which is an attempt to simulate traffic in regions microscopically. And microscopic means that we have the travelers microscopic, but we also have vehicles microscopic, and links and traffic signals and things like that. And if you have ever done activity-based modeling, is kind of the upper level of this. And what this is trying is trying to take the activity-based travel plan and then put it down on the ground and then see if it works. Because, for example, it might not work because gets stuck in congestion, or maybe it tries to use a shared, I don't know, a shared bicycle, but the bicycle is not available. And so it's really trying to simulate these microscopic aspects. So it's dynamic, it's whole day, it's evidently time dependent, it has time dependent congestion. It uses these activity chains. I said that we try to do all modes, and we have facilities that we can teleport modes that we can't really implement. So we really do not just cut them out, but we have the full days, including all the modes that are there. It's meant to be large scale, which sometimes means cutting corners at certain levels of detail. It's modular, and this is a typo, but we have plugins for taxis and for congestion pricing, road pricing, for emissions, noise, and many others. And the whole thing is open source, as Itzhak said, and this is the place where it is on GitHub. A bit more about how it works. We have this thing that there's individual people. So essentially every real life person is represented by an avatar. The avatar has a daily plan. So here's, for example, a person that leaves home at 6:43, then takes the car to work. There's no arrival time at the work because that's emergent from the car trip. Then there's a departure at work, then another trip, and then maybe going shopping and then going home. Another person has a different plan, which has different sequences of activities. The activities have locations, as you will have guessed, different modes and all that. And then what we do is we take this stuff, we put it into the simulation that you have just seen, which is this thing. And then what we do is we give each of these plans a score. And it depends now where you come from. This is in transport, this would usually be a utility. Yeah? So there's a utility function. It's a bit similar to these things you have in discrete choice models, but it's a 24-hour utility function. So if you go to labor economics or Hara Diaz, you see very similar things. But in discrete choice modeling, it's usually a bit different because it's only a partial utility function. So you get this, and if you are in other areas, you would, for example, say it's a fitness function, yeah, if you're in evolutionary computation. So you take this thing, then we do this here, which is plans modification and plan selection. That's in evolutionary computation, something like mutation, or also selection of the fittest, which is actually usually non-survival of the non-fittest. And then it just keeps going around. So they keep modifying these things. They keep trying to get higher scores. And at some point, we usually say we're relaxed. It would be nice if we could prove convergence. Yeah, optimally, we're converged at some point. And then we have some equilibrium, but it's not a network equilibrium. It's really an equilibrium about the whole thing. So it's also about finding appropriate time slots, finding appropriate modes. Some of this is even finding appropriate locations. Yeah, sometimes we have, at least for secondary locations, we modify them. This is for these simulations, we're not doing it, but in principle, you can actually do it. And so what we come up with this kind of schedule equilibrium. And then the point is we can change something in the system. So you can take this whole thing you add some kind of additional mode, which might be the DRT mode, and then you run the whole thing again, and people will start trying the DRT mode. They will see if it fits well into their schedule, and if it fits well, they keep it, and then they usually have a utility gain. Now, in terms of DRT, I said we do this microscopically, and I mean that. Yeah, so we take all of Berlin. The scenario has 5 million people. We usually run 10% samples to make this a bit quicker, but we can actually run this up to 100%. And then you end up with these kinds of simulations here, where the red vehicles are vehicles with passengers and the green vehicles are vehicles without passengers. And here you have a vehicle, and then what it evidently does is with passenger drives to a place, drops off the passenger, then has an empty drive to the next pickup location, and then we'll have a passenger on board and drive that to the next destination. And by that, you actually get a mechanical microscopic model of DRT. I will say a little bit about pooling next. So right now that was single passenger. So what you evidently need is you need the service area where these things are actually running. You need initial positions of the fleet in the morning. You need to set the configuration. So do you want to have virtual stops, or do you actually go door to door? Do you do rebalancing during the day when the balance is off? What is your fare structure and all that? This talk will mostly be about fares. So this is roughly door to door. So in some sense, link to link. So there's one virtual stop per link. And I will mostly talk about the fares, and I will not actually do a lot for the other things. I said people try this and compare it. And so what happens is synthetic persons have this score, this plan, and then they just replace the trip mode by some other mode and see if that fits into their schedule. Now, in terms of ride hailing, there's this additional problem here. I mean, the structure is just like that. They walk to the street or to the stop. They request a trip, which is actually, when you can see there's room for improvement. You could pre-order this thing, but in this case, they just go there and wait. Then the vehicle needs to be dispatched, which is just a separate algorithm. The passenger is picked up. Then there might be additional DRT passenger picks up and drops off, and eventually you're dropped off, and then you walk to your trip destination. You see that this is actually pretty microscopic. So if you make virtual stops, then the trip to the virtual stop and from the virtual stop to the final destination is part of the simulation. And then evidently there needs to be a dispatch algorithm which somehow decides which of these vehicles goes there. And I mean, those of you who have tried this, is actually single passenger taxi dispatch is much cheaper than pooling. Pooling means multiple passengers in the same car at the same time. So you have to be a bit careful. Sharing means in our language that they use the taxi sequentially, so one after the other, but pooling means there's multiple passengers in the same vehicle at the same time. And then you need to kind of insert this everywhere, so this is pretty expensive. I could talk about that, but I will not. And then it's somehow working. What comes out evidently in terms of our simulation is something like this, that you have a vehicle and it goes there, then it has a stop. Unfortunately, this doesn't tell if it's a pickup or a drop off, but maybe we can imagine that all of these are pickups. And then now we're here. And then maybe this down here is a drop off, and then maybe the next stop is a pickup, and they start running around, and essentially if everything works well, they're never empty. And then evidently this is the user interface I have shown you. So this is the technology. The question is now about the fleet size, what size of fleet you need. I don't think this is a final solution, but this is what we have used in this project here, that we essentially say there's a decision variable. And the way this works, and this is why it had this somewhat weird title, is that we take the perspective of a regulated system. Yeah, so we say we have a service area. Inside this service area, we set a quality requirement. And the quality requirement in this case is, for example, that 90% of the waiting times for the vehicle need to be less than a certain amount of time. And so what the operator needs to do, it needs to increase the fleet or maybe find a more clever rebalancing algorithm in order to serve at that level, at least for the regular day we're simulating here. And so then we have this loop here that they try to reach this, and then they adjust the DRT service parameters, which mostly is the fleet size, and it just keeps doing this again. So we have a fleet size, then we have people ordering the service. They have a certain wait time. Because of the wait time, they may like this or not. And then in the end, the operator has to adjust this thing. So you get this bi-level thing where this is the inner loop is the behavioral loop and the outer loop is the operator loop. Now, if you look at results, I think this becomes quickly relatively clear what happens. So this is a very rural situation. I will come back to this later, but right now it's easier to explain this whole thing. And there are 4 different versions. One is that there's 50 vehicles. And as I said, this is a rural area, so 50 vehicles are kind of barely enough. And then there is these 3 targets. Here's the target: less than 5 minutes waiting time, less than 10-minute waiting time, less than 15 minutes waiting time in this quantile thing. And if you look at what's happening, you have the black thing where the number of DRT vehicles doesn't matter. It's always 50 because it's fixed. But here you have the number of DRT rides and it goes up to some level and then it levels out. And this goes along with this, which is the waiting time, which is pretty long. And now if we say, on the other hand, we want a waiting time of 5 minutes, which is this A thing, then what we see is the waiting time goes down to these 5 minutes here over the iterations. The number of rides goes up because it's more attractive. But what we see here is that the fleet size goes through the roof. So what essentially happens is somehow the spatial substrate of this thing is in a way that the 300 seconds are actually very difficult to match. And so they just keep adding vehicles in order to satisfy this criterion. I mean, evidently, this has to do with rebalancing. And in this case, the rebalancing doesn't seem to be optimal. One can probably improve this. But if you have a very rural, I mean, I don't know how many of you have actually done this, but what you actually find is in most cases, the waiting time is just the time from wherever the vehicle is to the customer. So it's usually not a backlog thing that's happening. And so it really has to do with how you can distribute your vehicles. And if you distribute them equally, uniformly, it usually works pretty well in cities, but it doesn't work in rural areas, because in rural areas, you probably want to have 1 or 2 or 3 vehicles in the middle of the village. And then that's it. And if they are all used, then you actually want to send other ones in there. And that is not fully working yet. So based on that, the idea is now that we simulate this thing in Berlin. As I said, this will be very quickly here because the data is not open. And then I will actually kind of go to other places, and then hopefully, at least I think I learned a lot, and maybe you will as well. So this is, as I said, very quickly, what we have is we have an area in the center of the city, which is this thing here. It's kind of the eastern part of the inner city. It's door-to-door service. It uses pooling, so multiple passengers per vehicle. All of this is still pre-corona in terms of calibration. And we use this dynamic adaptation of fleet side. The objective is waiting times less than 10 minutes. And there's a price, and that you have to memorize because that's important. The price is 1.5 euro per kilometer, but at least 4 euros. So essentially you enter, and then you have 2-point-something kilometers for free. And only after that, you actually start paying once the accumulated thing of this is above 4 euros. And this talk doesn't have it in there, but this actually it shows it in part. This is pretty important to not replace too many walk and bicycle trips, that you have like a minimum fare that's relatively steep in order to get these people out. So what you get is this here. We get about 3,000 rides per day, about 800 of them intermodal. This has always been a question. How much of this is that people actually come from the train and then use this thing, and there will be more results. They're not terribly optimistic. There's a fleet size, which is a little less than 100. We have ride distances, which depend on the area, and we have average ride times. And then we have ride distances over, and we have waiting time distributions. And the other thing we have is, this is the service area, these OD relations by district. And then we have weather pickups cluster. And all of this we can actually compare to the real data. And we can at least say it's reasonable. So the structure of this is reasonable. The other thing, which is kind of getting this number right, because it's just a certain share of all the trips, actually pretty small share, so that we at least have some idea that this is not totally stupid. Now let's assume that we believe that, and now go to some other places. Now it really depends what you want to do, because one thing that we try to do, and I don't know if you can see the chat, if that's available, but I will just put it in there. That might not. Can I send to everybody? Panelists and attendees. Yeah. Okay. So this is now in the chat. If you rather want to play around, that's fine with me. We're trying to make these results accessible, and this has gone to stakeholder meetings, but somehow I think for many stakeholders that might still be way too technical, but at least those people who have some technology experience, which are in particular the PT operators in these areas, I think they have actually taken this up and have started using it. So this might be a way to go. So essentially you can go on the area. This is this Vulkaneifel thing. I will talk about this a little later. This is now in German because it's oriented towards a German audience, but you have this express Aviv, which just means an express version of this, which has to do with regulations. Just ignore the express, but I think it's easy to remember if you want to find the same thing. And then you can actually have these fun things with simulations that you can actually start having moving pictures in this case, and you can kind of have the actual path they go, and you can have the request in this whole thing. And then you can actually see how this whole thing develops over time. So the requests come in, and then at some point vehicles pick up the requests and drive them to the destination. And then there's the numbers of passengers and all that. And this is actually relatively useful to get some idea of what's going on. And then the other thing which is interesting, I mean, there's lots of plots here, but one that we have is, this is the, how do you say, the number of passengers along links in this new service plus in the conventional public transport. And then you get something like this, and then evidently there's all these things you can do, and that's not the main point I want to make, but the main point I want to make is, let me move this to the right and then have some other to the left. On the left is the public transport system, how it is right now in terms of usage. On the right is how it would be if we had a certain type of DRT service. So the rural areas, this is in some sense it's like an explosion. You get a totally different public transport system. This here is the regional train. Yeah. So the reason why there is a thicker line is actually because it's the train line that goes to the nearest big city. This is the main location, the main village in this area is down, but that doesn't have a train connection. So there's a still relatively large demand between Gerolstein and Down. There's also a relatively large demand between Down and Ulm, but if you look at this like going in the little villages, then really nothing happens. Whereas here now you suddenly see that this whole system is really reaching out into all these areas. Lots and lots and lots of usage of this thing. You also see that they're actually driving this way because that's faster. So right now it goes here because it's stopping at more intermediate villages, but evidently to get people fast from A to B, that's actually a bad option. And then you also see that they are serving the train, but the train is actually not gaining that much. And that's kind of also a bit the other part of the story that might actually become important a little later. So this is Billy Charlton, who wasn't mentioned at the beginning, but one or two in the audience, I'm sure know him. So he has been working on making this accessible in a better way. So this is these three areas. This is Berlin, which is a city. I mean, maybe a little bit like Tel Aviv. This is Vulkaneifel. It's a very rural area. And this is Gladbeck, which is a bit suburban. This is the Ruhr area, the Ruhrgebiet in Germany. So this is about, I don't know, 5 million people, or probably even more. And it's kind of at the fringes. It's a bit at the borderline. So this is a suburban scenario. The important ones are the ones to the right and the left. And this just gives an intermediate point to kind of see if these things make any sense. And the areas are the bluish ones for what comes now. The other thing you have to remember is that there are two different price structures. So one is that we have what I have already explained, 1.5 euro per kilometer, but you have a 4 euro minimum fare. And I will usually call this today's prices. And I say with human driver, but it's not that we try to make exact cost recovery. It's just kind of an approximation, and you will see how this will play out. And then I say something with is future. And what has happened here is that we just integrated this service into the regular public transit fare. Yeah? So it's not something like 35 cents per kilometer, but it is that we say there is already a public transport fare, and we just say for the same amount of money of pricing, you can now actually use this new service, and we will see where we end up. And as I said, this is this regulated thought. So we assume there's a regulatory body that imposes this on the operator, and they have to see if they can actually make do with this. So this is what we usually do for mode choices. We have these Sankey diagrams, which is like, I mean, you just had elections, so you probably know these things. It's exactly the same thing. And then what you have is that here, in this case, this is prices today. And what we see is that this new service in Berlin, which is the inner city, actually does not get a very large mode share. And if you go to this rural area, it actually gets a pretty large mode share. And this is in spite of the relatively high prices. So Here it's really making a big difference. In the inner city, it's essentially just an add-on. And then we have this thing which is PT with DRT use. This is these intermodal trips. In Germany, at least, they're talking about this a lot, that DRT could be a last mile service supporting conventional PT. We consistently find it's not working that way. It's always taking something out of public transport. It's getting a lot of stuff from, in this case here, from bicycle and from ride, which is the rural area where this actually makes a lot of sense that it works that way. It's doing intermodal trips, which is also actually technologically relatively difficult, but it's not large amounts. So this is a pretty clear story, comes out consistently. It will not work this way. If you want to achieve more in this category, you need to regulate heavily. And then what we usually find is people, you take the DRT to the train station and then take the next DRT from the train station to wherever they want to go, and they do not take the train in between. And the reason is that there's lots of legitimate trips, because people have trips of 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers. Right now, they take the bus. The bus is awkward because it only comes once an hour in these areas, or they walk, but 4 kilometers is too much to walk. They could take the bicycle, but many of them don't for various reasons. And so you either have to use your own car or you can't make the trip. And so I think this is legitimate trips of public transport, and we need to see this as part of public transport, not as competition, at least for this type of approach I'm pushing here. So now this is future prices. If you integrate this into the public transport tariff, and what you see there is it's dramatic. Yeah, so this is the inner city thing, and the inner city thing is public transport. The conventional thing shrinks to something that's pretty small. The intermodal thing is still not a lot, but you get a huge share of DRT. You actually reduce car share quite a lot. So if you think about making DRT electric and regulating it to some extent, this is actually not so bad. And in this case, we're actually not getting a lot of people from bicycle and also not that many from walk because of, yeah, I mean, the PT fare still has this thing that the ticket is actually relatively expensive to get started with. And then if you go to the rural area, it's even more dramatic. Essentially, the car has died out. And then you have these PT has gone down by a factor of 2. I mean, there's still the long distance train. There's 1 or 2 long distance buses, so they still survive, but all of the local stuff has actually moved over to this other system. We still have that the intermodal stuff is not a lot. The bicycle is essentially not there anymore in this rural area. So it's pretty dramatic, dramatic changes across the board. Okay. This is trip distances. The only thing that is interesting to note here is that in the rural area, you actually get pretty long trip distances, up to 20 kilometers. This is the origin destination patterns, and this is again the relatively stiff prices and the affordable prices, and this is the origin destination network that comes out in Berlin. Also drastically different. If you would use these expensive prices, I mean, this is what this is now, and this you have to kind of think about what this is. This is the services offered everywhere for these prices, and passengers select where they want to use them. Yeah, and what they say is we want to use this service in the outskirts, because that's where the conventional public transport doesn't work well. And so this service is actually very good. If you make the slots cheaper, you get a totally different picture, because then it starts competing with the conventional public transport. So it's hugely different spatial layout of this whole thing. And these are kind of villages or in the Berlin city limits. This is the traffic volumes on the road, today's prices, daily traffic volume. And this is, I think, okay. But if you look into the future, the scales are a bit different. So you actually get huge additional amounts of vehicle kilometers on your road system. And for Berlin, this could not be carried. So we would have lots more congestion than right now. So something else needs to happen there. In the rural areas, evidently, this type of system would not be such a problem because there's enough capacity. So again, vastly different. Now I'm already heading towards my last slide. As I said, I assume that prices are regulated on these 2 levels. I also assume that service quality is regulated by the wait time for the pickup, as I have tried to explain. And the costs on the vehicles are also given, but in some sense, they're not even a parameter right now, because what happens is the operator is forced to provide the service, and then we can only see if the operator survives financially or not. In this thing, the operations are not optimized. So I think you could still squeeze something out if you optimize. Right now, we're just trying to find something that works. And so essentially what you get is some ideas of the maximum subsidies that are necessary in order to run this thing. And then you get this table, and this is a dense table, and I have like erased a little bit so that it's not so bad. But the important ones right now for our purposes is this one here and this one, and then I will say a little bit about this. This is the Berlin thing we have seen, and this is the Vulkaneifel thing we have seen in the rural situation. And then we have like revenues, necessary vehicles to fulfill the service requirements, vehicle fixed costs that we put in, and there's kind of numbers down here that you can believe or not, but they come from the German national assessment exercise, the operation times of these things, the driver costs, which have to do with hourly wages, total vehicle kilometers, vehicle operating costs, total costs, and all that. And what you find is this is if you force an operator to provide a service within all of Berlin with these prices I have told you, that operator will make a daily loss of 50,000 euros. Yeah, so this is what happens here per day. However, if that operator concentrates on just the inner city, that operator will make just about profit. And that's actually the reason why the system in Berlin is the way it is, because the public transit operator was not allowed to put subsidies into the system. And so they were negotiating with the operator, and the operator said, okay, if we have this and this fare structure, we can barely make a profit. And that's why they do this. But in terms of what we need, this is the wrong way to go. I mean, as you saw, is if we give this to people, what the people want is this. They don't want this in the inner city. I mean, there's a little bit there, but the over demand is there. So in some sense, this is going totally in the wrong direction. Yeah, we put it where the operators can make money, but we do not put it there where users want it. Now, Vulkaneifel rural area comes out that one would actually make quite a profit with this already right now. So the thing is there, they need to get their structure sorted out. Right now they have taxi services, and then you're not allowed to compete with taxi services, and then you start getting these Uber things. And in Germany, in principle, they need to return after each trip to the home base, which then makes this inefficient. So there's lots of regulatory things. But here, it would actually be possible to put it in without actually losing money at these higher prices, which is then again a problem in Germany. Now, if you go down to the public transport prices, as I said, the cheaper prices, which in this case, we put in here. And what happens here now with the cheaper prices, we assume that there's no human drivers. Yeah, so this is kind of the assumption about the future where these things are driverless. And then what comes out in all of these situations, there's huge profits to be made. Yeah, which I think is pretty obvious, is the speculation that Uber makes. At some point, the human drivers are no longer necessary. And then they have the market share and the operating experience. And then the whole thing becomes hugely cheap. And I want to point out again, because it becomes hugely cheap, it will work well in the rural areas, but it will be terrible in the inner cities because we don't have the road space. So this is pretty much it. I mean, as I said, I start from regulated prices and regulated service requirement. The typical simulations you see, they can actually reject services. So they say, okay, this is a trip I reject. These guys can't reject. They need to put in a sufficient number of vehicles to serve their area. Urban versus rural is really vastly different in the results. If you do current prices, the urban situations, the users want to be in outskirts, but the operators want to be in the center. And in rural is, according to our simulations, it would already be profitable today. Somehow they are not making the move. I can't really say why. Maybe our computations are completely wrong, but I think it also has to do with that you actually need to say, okay, right now they have taxi service and they have conventional bus. You need to get rid of taxi service. You need to get rid of conventional bus and replace them by these new services for this whole thing to make sense. And this is actually hard to do. Future prices I have talked about. Road capacity totally overwhelmed. In urban, rural, I think it will be okay. And then we have huge operator gains everywhere, given that pricing regimes. Now, there's two challenges in Germany. One is for rural, how to organize the transition. What's happening right now, they're negotiating conventional contracts that will sit there for 10 years. So we will have conventional buses run around for the next 10 years, although we already have the technology to move on. We're way too slow, I think. And in urban, the thing is we need to figure out how to allocate the road capacity. And maybe you just think about a city toll, and that would be a good solution. We see this also in simulations. However, the Germans are averse to these kind of market-oriented schemes, so there needs to be something else. And quite in general, it's right now the city jurisdictions have no jurisdiction to restrict road usage. So even if your city is completely congested and nobody can move, the cities can't do anything. It needs to be the national government. And the national government essentially says, oops, if somebody can make money, we don't care. So we have this two-level problem, and we have a real problem getting our hands into these things. So that was what I wanted to say. Thank you for listening, or whatever you did. So let me see if I can see some of you now. There you are. So let me move you over here.
Okay, I'm taking out my telephone. The organization is very complicated. Those who are in the public have to ask the question, and I will repeat it here, and Kai will be able to answer. Those who are on the Zoom have to type the question in Q&A, and we have about 5-10 minutes, so please try to formulate short questions. Go ahead. Okay, Tal, please. Yeah.
Hi. So thanks. Can you comment about the capacity of the DRT vehicles in your simulation and about their fill rate, the number of passengers, the average number of passengers?
Yes, that was my question too. So you didn't mention the occupation of the DRT vehicles and how large they are. And that was the question of Tal and myself as well. Yeah.
Right. Good question. I always forget because it doesn't matter. We usually assume something like 4 or 6 or 8, somewhere in that area. So smallish buses or large limousines, but the share of the passengers is usually in the area of 2 or 3 or 4. Yeah, so I think if you have buses that have 7 or 8 passengers, that's a good size. And then you can also put a little bit of freight in or something if you have to, or a wheelchair, but we never have this bundled in larger sizes. The only difference here is, and this is actually something that makes this pretty complicated, is that the schools in, especially in this rural area, also serve through this service. And then these relatively smallish buses actually become too small. And in some sense, what you get out of this is if you don't have human drivers, what you start having is these things kind of as semi-trains or something. So you have 2 or 3 or 4 of these vehicles that all have 8 seats coupled in a train, and then they actually would move together, or maybe just in short distance. So that's roughly the thing. I think if you think about like these 7 or 8 seaters, this is a good starting point, and they are rarely overloaded except for school traffic.
More questions, please.
Maybe I take one from the QA. How many agents are there in the models?
Okay.
The Berlin metro area, the model we have is 5 million people, but in the city limits is more like 3.8. We usually take a 25% sample in order to make this runnable in the computational sense, and we have some idea how this scales. That's just for computational. Now, in terms of relating to the actual traffic in Berlin, I think you have to take these mode choice diagrams that I showed you if you go back in my presentation. Yeah, that with these low fares, we get like 10 or 20% of the trips. So if you have roughly 3 million people, they make roughly 3 million trips. So it's maybe 10 million trips per day. And so then these DRTs would take 10 to 20% out of that. Yeah, so 1 to 2 million. And in the rural area, I don't know the numbers by heart. It's lower than that, but they get a larger share. But I hope that gives you some idea. It's pretty sizable. I mean, it's similar to the current car mode.
Thank you. One more question from Hillel, please.
What about the level of service in terms of people? You mentioned the level of service in wait time, but then once I'm on the vehicle,
See, I repeat the question. What is the level of service in terms of detours? How many?
Yeah. There are parameters in there, and I don't know them by heart, but usually it's actually pretty sizable. I think they can be 70% more time than the direct trip, and maybe 5 minutes more. Yeah, so if the direct connection is something like 10 minutes, it could happen that it's 22 minutes. Yeah, 10 minutes times 1.7 is 17 minutes plus another 5 minutes for the base time that is in there. So this is the way it works is an insertion is accepted if this condition is not, how do you say, reached by any of the passengers who are already in there, plus the passenger who is new. And if that condition is not fulfilled, the operator needs to send an additional vehicle.
Yoram, please. Yoram is asking why not to increase the fares in the future scenarios and investigate the elasticity of all those parameters to the fares.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way public transport in Germany is constructed is that it's assumed to be, I don't even know, it's Daseinsvorsorge in German, is kind of a basic service like water and electricity. And because of that, the prices are regulated down to a certain relatively low level. And so now what you see, especially in these rural areas, is that they have these large buses, but they are actually empty most of the day. And so the question is if it wouldn't be better to take the buses out and replace this by this type of service. But then if they're replaced because it's this public service requirement, you can't make it any more expensive. Yeah, so that's right now the challenge for this whole thing. And in some sense, the stupid answer we're getting right now is that it would be better to leave the conventional buses in place, because you saw that's a relatively small share of the demand, so that it actually doesn't cost a lot, and have this additional service just on top and use slightly higher prices in order to make this more balanced. But then you would have a lot of empty buses running around just in order to fulfill the public service requirement. So that feels pretty stupid.
Please, one more.
What are the factors contributing to the urban and model congestion? Is it a shift from public transportation to BRT or empty vehicles between passengers?
Comparing different factors that cause the congestion. Let's say the travelers who use DRT or empty vehicles traveling between the points of pickup. What is the relative weights of different factors?
Yeah, if you have single passenger operators, then having the empty trips in between increases vehicle kilometers by about 13%. If you start using pooling, this is evidently kind of compensated for by having multiple passengers in the vehicles, and it kind of goes down to below 1. Yeah, so it overcompensates for these 13% plus, but not a lot. So in the end, what we get is something like, I mean, it's slightly below 1, 0.9 or 0.95 multiplied by the vehicle kilometers we have today, if vehicles are just used from origin to their destination, and then they are parked at both ends. So it's not a huge game changer. Yeah, you can squeeze it to something that's a little less than today, but that's about it. What we find is this kind of the flip side of what I said earlier. We don't get very huge pooling ratios. Yeah, we usually have maybe 2 passengers per vehicle, sometimes 3, but it's usually not more. It gets a lot better if you start serving central facilities. So if you have like a traffic to a central rail station or all that, or the schools, then you actually get much better pooling. But for this door-to-door stuff, it's actually not the big game changer.
We're close to the end, and I will use my place as a chair for the last question. So, Kai, if I follow my, let's say, a pessimistic view of the future DRT, I will say that it's very good for the country, but very bad for the city. So did you consider it's bad because it's too flexible. So we exploit it too much and it fills everything, all the urban space, and there is no top at all. So maybe some intermediate half flexible transportation, like say vans, which follow constant routes, but with flexible time, can fill that gap. You can put them over the periphery of the city, don't let them go into the center, something intermediate, which is less flexible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. You just need to find a way to not let them into the city. I mean, for the individual person, once the person is sitting in this device, and it has the option to take the van directly to the city center, or first have to go to the train station and then use the train, evidently just staying in the van is much more convenient. So you need some way to get them out there. And as I said, I mean, if you can actually have tolls, that would probably work pretty well, because then you would say in the outskirts, I have no toll. So the van brings you to the train is affordable, so you can take the train to the inner city. But if the person insists on taking the van directly to the inner city, then the toll has to be paid by the passengers. So that works pretty well. But if you can't address it via a monetary incentive, then doing this by regulation will be relatively difficult.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. It was a really interesting lecture. We enjoyed it greatly. So let's you can see myself only, so this is the reaction of the audience. Thanks again. And
Okay. Thank you very much for getting me
continue
here.
with the next section.